This week, we are going to look at the presidency, the executive power in our federal government, and that is the second power provided for in the Constitution. So, Article 1 sets up the most powerful branch, the Congress. Article 2 sets up the presidency, the second most powerful branch. And if you're thinking, but wait a minute, isn't the presidency the most powerful? The answer to that is yes and no. Certainly, the framers envisioned the legislature as the most powerful branch, and I would argue that it is still the most powerful, but the presidency has certainly gained a great deal more power over history. The difference is that when the president does things unilaterally, when the president does things by himself, those things are pretty easily changed either by the next president or by Congress. If they want to change them, those things are very easy to change. Whereas when Congress acts through legislation, that is very hard to change. So ultimately, Congress has more power. The presidency has, and this was envisioned by the framers, the presidency has more energy, more ability to act quickly, to respond quickly to things that you don't have the time when you don't have the time to wait for the legislature to grind through its deliberative process. So, one function of the president is largely symbolic. He is considered the chief of state. This is the same role that the Queen plays in the UK. She is head of state. But whereas the Queen exercises no political power whatsoever, the president is a politician, has a great deal of power. But this chief of state function, that is that symbolic function of representing the United States for big international events, for big international agreements. The president is the face of the United States government. And sometimes the United States presidency, has actually been put in an even bigger symbolic role during the Cold War. You had the president of the United States was not only the symbolic head of the U.S., the president was the symbolic head of NATO, of quote unquote the West, or as the phrase goes, the leader of the free world. I don't hear that phrase quite so much anymore. Since the end of the Cold War, it's been declining in usage, although I'm sure presidents still would like to claim that prestige. But without this sort of bilateral conflict shaping everything in the world, it's a little bit harder to sustain. But there's a whole lot more going on in the presidency than just that symbolic role. The president, as I said, has real power in the government, whereas the Queen has stepped back from that. Parliament exercises the real power in the British system. The president has real power. So in addition to being chief of state, Scott wears a lot of hats. And newly elected presidents learn pretty quickly that there's a whole lot more to the job than just showing up for photo ops and shaking hands and having signing ceremonies for signing laws. There are several sources for presidential power, and several different sort of broad categories of jobs the president does. On one hand, the president is the chief executive, the executive power in the government, head of all the executive departments, ultimately the person responsible for seeing that the laws of the country are put into effect. The president is also the the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and the chief diplomat. So those functions look out at the rest of the world, and the president is the face of the United States in dealing with the rest of the world. And in addition to all of that, there's always a political role going on. The president is always having to engage in politics in the sense of trying to craft deals and negotiate compromises in order to get things done, either with other countries in those outward-facing roles, or trying to get Congress to do things that he wants, to support his policies. So there's always the politics of the job, and he sort of plays the role of head of his party, not technically, but again, symbolically head of the party, certainly the most visible person in his party. So the president's role in setting the agenda for Congress is a combination of those things. The president can influence Congress by acting as a politician, by lobbying members to support or oppose legislation, by defining. He can use his ability to get the attention of the media, or to use social media to speak directly to people. He can use that to try to set the agenda for Congress. Or he can use more official means. He can use the fact that he submits a proposed budget to Congress every year to literally try to set the agenda for Congress, to say, these are the things I think ought to be funded, and this is how much I think each should be funded. Please make it so. One of his most important tools that he has is his ability to reject legislation, that veto power, the ability, if Congress gives him something he doesn't approve of, to say no and require a supermajority if they want to make it happen anyway. Modern presidents have shown a great deal more willingness to exercise that veto power than early presidents did. The first few presidents saw the veto power as really something they would only exercise if they thought that Congress was trying to use legislation to exercise executive power. If they used it really only as protecting their sphere of influence. But pretty soon, presidents started to use the veto to oppose in a political way, to stop legislation that they just personally thought was a bad idea. And that has different presidents have used it to differing degrees, but on the whole, modern presidents have used it a great deal more than earlier presidents. The president who vetoed the most things was FDR. He really had a very strong vision and was facing two huge crises. FDR was president for the longest period. He served 4 terms before they put the 2-term limit. And he faced first the Great Depression and then the Second World War. So he was dealing with some unprecedented problems, but he vetoed an enormous number of pieces of legislation. Presidents are more likely, another sort of pattern, presidents are more likely to exercise their veto when the other party controls Congress. That makes sense. That's also when they're most likely to get pieces of legislation with which they disagree. If the other party is controlling Congress, then you're more likely to get ideological differences between the White House and Congress. And so you're more likely to get vetoes. An informal way that presidents have developed to influence legislation without actually vetoing it, something called the signing statement. This started with President James Monroe. It's been used more in the last several decades. What a signing statement is that in addition to just signing the bill into law, the president will attach to it a written statement regarding either, it can just be something celebratory, hey, I'm glad we finally got this thing done that I thought was important. But more recently, it's been things like, defining things that were left a little vague. So putting in there how the president thinks something that's open to interpretation should be interpreted, or putting in statements about how parts of the law the president thinks aren't constitutional and so shouldn't really be put into effect, or shouldn't be put into effect, or should only be put into effect if interpreted a particular way. So it's a way to try to influence the way the law is enacted by the president, setting some guidelines for the executive departments as they go to implement the law, rather than simply vetoing it, sending it back to Congress and hoping to get language clarified. This allows part or most of the law to go into effect, and the president is just trying to finesse parts of it. This doesn't draw on any provision of the Constitution does not provide this power. And until fairly recently, signing statements weren't used. This is sort of an innovation on the way signing statements are used in the last several decades. Actually, the Constitution didn't originally make it clear who got to interpret things when things were vague. In the Supreme Court decision Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution as giving the Supreme Court the right to interpret the Constitution. Signing statements are sort of then the president claiming a piece of the ability to interpret the law or the Constitution. The Supreme Court hasn't weighed in on this explicitly. So the legal standing of signing statements is pretty nebulous. It hasn't been really established. There's no constitutional language to base it on. But then there wasn't really constitutional language to base judicial review on either, and that is now a very well-established precedent. It's an interesting attempt, sort of a political maneuver to try to put in a little personal guidance on a law, and it'll be interesting to see how that holds up and how that practice develops, and what the courts, if the courts ever rule on it, what they finally say about it. In addition to setting the agenda for or at least trying to influence the legislative agenda, the policy agenda for Congress, the president is also the manager of the economy. And they have numerous tools. And again, this is sort of an unofficial power of the president. It doesn't say manager of the economy is not in the Constitution, but presidents certainly have a great deal of power to affect the economy. They have numerous tools at their disposal, including just the fact that they do have such a big voice in the media. Presidents expressing confidence in the economy can make the economy more confident in itself. So much of economics is psychology, how secure investors feel. The president expressing some trepidation either about the economy or about pending events can also damage the economy. So because the president can affect the economy in the short term so much, and he's sort of become held responsible for the economy. There are also some official duties that the president has that do impact the economy directly and indirectly. So one of those is that he submits a proposed budget to Congress every year, and that lays out where the president thinks tax dollars should be spent, where federal money is going to go, which has a huge trickle-down effect. Where the federal government spends its money creates jobs or takes jobs away, both directly and indirectly, both through hiring people to do, say, infrastructure projects, or giving money to the states in block grants that the states then use to hire people. So both directly and indirectly, this has an impact on the economy. And the president making known that he wants certain things in the budget helps direct attention to them, and again helps with that agenda setting. Presidents also, through the executive departments, help to establish the regulatory and economic environment in which businesses operate. So, for example, through the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, presidents can have an impact on business operations either by approving new regulations that make it more difficult to get new licenses or to build in certain areas, or trying to roll back regulations to make those things easier to do, making business cheaper to conduct or more expensive to conduct. The president also appoints members of the Federal Reserve Bank, which is just known as the Fed normally, including the chairman of the Fed, who plays a crucial role. The Federal Reserve Bank is sort of the bank to banks. So there are regulations in place since the Great Depression that require banks to have a certain amount of cash on hand in case people want to withdraw their money, because that was part of the problem during the Great Depression. Is people started losing confidence in the economy. They wanted to withdraw their money, and the banks ran out of money and had to close. So there are requirements that a certain percentage of the amount of money deposited must be held in cash by the bank to be able to give people their money if they come to want it. The Federal Reserve is the bank that can loan banks that money on a short-term basis so that they can meet those requirements. And the Federal Reserve, in serving that function, they set the interest rates that they charge banks, which indirectly sets the interest rates, or certainly impacts the interest rates that banks charge us. So, or that banks pay depositors, and that affects the interest rates that get paid on everything. So indirectly, by setting that interest rate that they charge banks, the Fed impacts the interest rates you pay on your credit cards, on your student loans. If you now or in the future you own a house, the rates that are offered on mortgages, all of that is indirectly impacted by the president through the Federal Reserve. The president is also the chief diplomat of the country. Now, he doesn't do all diplomacy. He doesn't even do most diplomacy in person, but the president is in charge of diplomatic affairs. And so he's only the executive department that is empowered by the Constitution to do that work, to meet with representatives of foreign governments, to work out treaties, trade deals, any other kind of international agreements on, say, climate change or anything like that. The president, in order to fulfill this power, also appoints ambassadors to keep connections with other nations, to cultivate good relationships. And the president has the authority to enter into executive agreements. This is sort of the diplomatic version of signing statements. It's something that presidents have kind of come up with on their own. Treaties require Senate approval. So official treaties, like the treaty that established the North Atlantic Trade Organization, NATO, those require congressional approval. The president and the ambassadors and the diplomatic corps negotiate them. They can give preliminary approval that, yeah, we're satisfied with this, but then they have to bring it back and get Congress to approve it. That makes it much more secure because now it has the force, it's an actual official treaty. But that can be very difficult because then it's not something that the president can do on his own. He's got to bear in mind what Congress wants. And that can be very difficult, especially if Congress is controlled by the other party. But even if it's controlled by his party, that's a whole lot more people he's got to make happy. So presidents have come up with this idea of executive agreements. They'll just make an agreement with the chief executive of another country. So the president might make an agreement with the prime minister of Canada about something, and it's an agreement between them. It's not a treaty. It doesn't require Senate approval. It also, though, isn't secure against congressional action. If Congress decides they dislike what the president has agreed to, they can pass legislation that would change it. Now, presumably, he'd veto it, so they have to have a supermajority to go override a veto, but they could do it. More realistically, the next president isn't bound by it. So Donald Trump can enter into an executive agreement with the Prime Minister of Canada, and Joe Biden is not bound to honor it. So they are really almost like personal agreements between the people. The president can also just change his mind. Since he didn't have to get anybody's buy-in to do it, he also doesn't have to get anybody to buy in to change it. Also related to this idea that the president is the chief diplomat is his role as commander-in-chief of the military, of all the armed forces. That is an interesting innovation in the United States, that idea of making sure that a civilian is in charge of the armed forces. And that is something that is very much ingrained in our armed forces, that ultimately there you have the military command, but ultimately they answer to the president. So that means that the armed forces will serve the overall civilian government and the needs of the country, not just the needs of the military. It's an insurance policy that you're not going to have military, because they have all the weapons, or at least all the big weapons, seizing control of the country. Very important that they have that loyalty to the president as commander-in-chief. Although, generals are the ones working out strategy. The president also, in everything the president does, he has many advisors. But counseled by his advisors, the president can decide when to send troops into battle. He cannot declare war. And this has become something like the executive agreements thing, because with the technology we have today, as opposed to 1789, the space of time between sort of the beginning of hostilities and the potential end of hostilities is very, very narrow. So in 1789, you had time, ships had to sail across the Atlantic before a war could break out. So you had a lot of time to respond and get Congress to declare war. The last time Congress officially declared war was World War II. Since then, we've had the development of nuclear weapons, and the time that you need to respond is much, much quicker. You can't wait for Congress to even convene, much less argue everything in their deliberative way before you might need to respond. If somebody is attacking the country or our interests abroad or one of our allies, we may need to respond before Congress can realistically get together and declare war. And so the president can decide, and Congress has delegated some power to the president to respond quickly in times like that. So the president can decide when to send troops into battle and can set the overall military strategy, although, again, you've got a lot of military minds, if it comes down to that, working out the details of strategy. But the president may decide between this plan or that plan. So he's in charge of overseeing military readiness and responding to threats. And that may mean that he sends troops in without asking Congress. Now, Congress has delegated some power, but they also left themselves the power to decide, once they can get together, to say, okay, you can respond to the emergency situation. But then if we get together and decide that, no, we don't want to be there, Congress can then command the president to withdraw. It can say, hey, back off. Generally, though, once we've committed troops, Congress isn't going to step in quite that overt a way, because that, by having troops there, we've made the situation is probably now too dangerous to withdraw from. So the president has a lot of power under that heading of being commander-in-chief. And then the president is also, at least symbolically, the leader of his party and the party's biggest, most famous face, party's biggest fundraiser. So the fact that he has won that position, again, people like to donate to a winner. They like to support somebody successful, hoping that then they'll have maybe a little access to favors. Now, officially, though, I just want to be clear on this. Officially, the president is not head of the party. Officially, the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee have elected party chairs. They are elected by the party. They are not appointed by the president. But generally speaking, a president can indicate who he thinks the chair of the party ought to be, and that is going to go a long way towards getting that person elected. So he's got a great deal of influence on the party, but he's not actually the head of the party. And there can be disagreements between the president and the rest of the party leadership. The president also acts as the head of the party in day-to-day operations. Again, this all comes back to the fact that the president gets so much more public and media attention that can translate into influence that he can wield in other places, because nobody wants to go against a popular president. Especially his own party. At the end of a president's term, the president is also likely to help campaign for the party's next nominee. Often that person is the sitting president's vice president, although not always. And then the president is also the chief executive. That is, he is the head of all of the executive offices and agencies. The top, he then appoints the leaders of all of those executive branches, all of the offices within the executive branch. The secretaries, those are the members of the cabinet, the heads of the 15 departments, so Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, also heads of other government agencies that aren't quite at that secretary level, and other staff members. The president has an opportunity to nominate or appoint a huge number of people, which gives him an opportunity to reward people who have supported him in getting elected. Now, it is a lot less than it used to be under the old patronage system, where presidents literally had thousands and thousands of positions that they could award. That has been reformed because what was happening is you were getting a lot of unqualified people into positions. The need for some continuity and some general minimal qualifications in the bureaucracy at the rank and file level of the bureaucracy was recognized. But the leadership positions he still appoints. And while some of the highest of these positions need Senate approval, the Senate generally goes along with what the president wants. They may grill a nominee, but very rarely do they actually fail to confirm a nominee. They generally give the president the leadership team that he wants to work with. And through the leadership team, it helps shape the way the bureaucracy is going to operate. As the chief executive, the president is charged by the Constitution with ensuring that the laws be faithfully executed. In order to do that, a huge bureaucracy has developed because we have so many laws. And so we have more than 4 million people working for the government. That includes all the members of the military. and an annual federal budget of nearly $4 trillion. So the president is overseeing 4 million employees, directly or indirectly, and $4 trillion, again, directly or indirectly. So that does give him a huge amount of power.